Many people have difficulty understanding how invisible rays, which can't even be felt, can be so dangerous.
Many people may have already heard or read about the story of the Japanese man named Hisashi Ouchi. He's sometimes called the man who received the highest radiation dose in history. But that's not the truth. In fact, there were at least 6 other people who were exposed to much higher doses than Hisashi Ouchi. And I'm not even referring to the American Albert Stevens, also known as Patient Colwan. Albert Stevens is known as the person who survived the highest cumulative radiation dose ever recorded in a human. In fact, Stevens received injections in his body containing plutonium-238 and plutonium-239, the same elements used as fuel in nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons, without his knowledge, as part of a series of plutonium injection experiments on humans from the Manhattan Project, which led to 2 nuclear bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These experiments tried, among other things, to find an effective treatment for curing cancer. In fact, during his lifetime, Stevens was exposed to a dose of 64 SV of radiation from several injections containing small amounts of plutonium that he received. Conversely, Hisashi Ouchi's story is even more frightening, not only because it involves high doses of radiation, but also because he was kept alive for as long as possible. Considering that he was exposed to a dose of 17 SV, he wouldn't have lived more than 14 days. But in the name of science, he was kept alive for 83 days. Hisashi Ouchi's accident occurred on the morning of September 30, 1999, at the Tokaimura nuclear fuel processing plant in Japan. Hisashi Ouchi and 2 other colleagues were purifying uranium oxide to make fuel rods for a research reactor. Hisashi Ouchi was closest to the tank holding a funnel, and his colleague named Masato Shinohara was pouring a mixture of intermediate enriched uranium oxide into the tank using a bucket. Suddenly, they were startled by a flash of blue light, which indicated that something had gone very wrong. The worker who was pouring the mixture into the tank, who did not have much experience handling uranium of that level of enrichment, had inadvertently put much more uranium into the tank than was supposed to. Hisashi Ouchi, who was 46 cm closer to the tank, received a massive dose of neutron and gamma radiation. In the days that followed, while he was hospitalized, his symptoms included nausea, dehydration, diarrhea, slightly reddened facial skin, and pain in his ears and hand. The highlight was on the 6th day when a specialist looked at images of the chromosomes from Hisashi Ouchi's bone marrow cells, and all he could see were just scattered black dots indicating that they were broken into pieces. Hisashi Ouchi's body could no longer generate new cells, and from then on, the situation only got worse. He could no longer breathe unaided, his body stopped regenerating, and his chest began to fall apart. Exposure to 4 to 5 sieverts of radiation over short periods gives the victim a 50% chance of dying within the next 30 days. 10 sieverts of exposure is a certain death sentence. The next 6 people were exposed to even higher doses of radiation than Hisashi Ouchi received. The first with the highest dose of radiation was Louis Slotin. He received 4 sieverts more than Hisashi, that is 21 sieverts. Louis Slotin's accident is quite well known. It happened in 1946 during the Manhattan Project, at a time when American nuclear science was taking its first steps. Louis Slotin was a physicist on the project, and he conducted criticality experiments. Inside the laboratory where the experiments were conducted, there was a strange sphere, a sphere made of plutonium and gallium. This sphere was, in fact, the core of a nuclear weapon. The sphere was safe and could even be touched by hand while wearing gloves, and it felt warm to the touch. However, one thing that would be quite dangerous would be to completely cover the sphere using 2 beryllium hemispheres. That's because beryllium reflects neutrons that are continuously and naturally released by the core into the surrounding environment back into the core, and that creates a criticality event. In other words, the chain reactions of the radioactive elements inside the core start to happen uncontrollably, and the core becomes supercritical. In fact, it doesn't even take a second after the spheres close around the core for it to become supercritical. Louis Slotin was conducting this exact type of experiment. On a fateful day, Slotin was using a screwdriver to keep one of the hemispheres partially lifted over the core, until the screwdriver slipped and the hemispheres closed completely over the core. Instantly, a blue light appeared. Slotin immediately lifted the hemisphere and dropped it on the floor, ending the criticality event. But he had already been exposed to 21 sieverts of radiation. He lived only 9 days after the accident. The Chernobyl accident is quite well known and widely discussed. Few people know the story of the man who likely received the highest radiation dose. His name, Alexander Lilichenko. During the confusion after the explosion of Reactor 4, the electrician, Alexander Lilichenko, knew he would have to go to the electrolysis room to make emergency repairs. He knew that the room had massive levels of radiation, and he chose to sacrifice himself and enter the electrolysis room 3 times to protect the lives of his younger colleagues. And he managed to shut off the hydrogen supply, which is an explosive gas, to the generators. However, he had been exposed to 25 sieverts of radiation. Lilichenko even went back home at the end of the day and had dinner with his wife. He returned to the Chernobyl plant the next day. He lived only 2 weeks after the event. In 1958, an accident occurred at the plutonium processing station in Los Alamos in the United States. At this station, the element plutonium was chemically separated from several other compounds associated with it. The employee named Cecil Kelly had as one of his duties to operate a large tank with a capacity of 1,000 liters that contained a cocktail of various dangerous substances, such as the highly corrosive nitric acid, among many others. On that day, the tank was supposed to contain an amount of 0.1 gram.
Plutônio por litro de solução.
Somehow, there were 20 grams of plutonium per liter, or 200 times more than expected. And because the tank was large, it contained 3 kilograms of plutonium, enough to sustain a criticality event. As soon as Cecil turned on the tank and mixing began, the plutonium dissolved and sank. With a vortex created during the mixing, the plutonium concentrated and became supercritical. Cecil Kelly and 2 other employees at the station saw a short flash of blue light and nothing else. The flash lasted only 200 microseconds, or 0.0002 seconds. But Kelly had already been exposed to 36 sieverts of radiation. Shortly after, Kelly began to experience uncoordinated muscle movements, and in the hours that followed while he was hospitalized, his lymphocytes had already disappeared. His bone marrow became watery and contained no red blood cells. And 35 hours after the accident, Kelly passed away. On July 4, 1961, the Soviet nuclear submarine K-19 was conducting exercises in the Atlantic Ocean. This was a hastily built and poorly tested submarine, made to keep up with the competition from American nuclear submarines. The submarine was on its maiden voyage when suddenly there was a major coolant leak from one of its 2 reactors. As soon as the reactor ran out of coolant, its temperature rose to extremely dangerous levels. The reactor reached 800 degrees Celsius, and the crew feared that the reactor would melt down and release nuclear fuel. And a backup coolant system for the reactor, which was included in the submarine's design, simply wasn't installed. Fearing a tragic outcome, the captain ordered 8 engineering team members to devise a plan. The plan they came up with was to create a new cooling system by cutting a ventilation valve and welding a water supply pipe to it. The problem was that by cutting this ventilation pipe, it would spread radioactive steam among the crew. The improvised cooling system successfully reduced the temperature in the reactor, and it did not melt down. However, the entire crew was irradiated. But the 8 members of the engineering team were the most irradiated. The lowest dose they received was 7.5 sieverts. But one of the team members, named Boris Korchlov, received 54 sieverts of radiation exposure. In a brief talk with the K-19 submarine commander, he told Boris, "Boris, do you know where you're going?" And Boris replied, "I know, Captain." In the minutes that followed, Boris began to vomit. The skin that wasn't protected by clothing started to turn red. His hands and face began to swell, and Boris died 6 days after the accident. It's hard to believe, but there are at least 2 other people who were exposed to even higher doses of radiation than Boris Korchlov. This story took place in 1971 at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, which was the heart of the nuclear weapons program of the former Soviet Union. The institute was responsible for designing several nuclear reactors, including the RMBK, which would later explode in Chernobyl. At the end of more than a day of work, the experiments with the reactor had already been completed, and the workers were in the process of shutting it down. This involved draining the reactor's water system, which served as a moderator, meaning it reduced or stopped the emission of fast neutrons. The standard procedure required the water to be drained very slowly and with great care. However, no one knows. Maybe that day the workers were in a big hurry and used a large emergency drain at the bottom of the tank. The rapid removal of the moderator water caused the structure to heat up, creating excess pressure that bent the base of the reactor. As a result, the uranium rods came out of their fittings and fell to the bottom of the assembly, where they created a criticality event. There was a brief blue flash, the rods melted, and the reaction stopped. The flash lasted only a few milliseconds. However, one worker was exposed to 60 SV of radiation. He was very close to where the rods fell. He died the day after the accident from a heart attack. Another nearby technician was exposed to 20 SV of radiation. This whole story was kept secret for many years because it was believed that a radioactive cloud had escaped to a nearby city called Moscow. This is certainly the biggest and most serious case of high radiation exposure ever reported. It happened at the Wood River Junction nuclear facility in 1964. The facility was designed to recover highly enriched uranium from scrap materials, such as fuel rods from nuclear reactors or research centers, dissolve them in acid, and run them through a series of processes to recover the enriched uranium they contain. The safety standards were quite low at that facility, and there were these 11-liter plastic containers known in the industry as safe geometry, which could hold a concentrated solution of uranium or trichloroethylene. These containers were elongated to take advantage of the fact that uranium needs to be physically compacted in order to become critical. The elongated container design ensures that even if it is filled with uranium, the material will not become critical because of the distance between the material at the top and the bottom. The containers were all identical, and the only way to know whether they contained a concentrated uranium solution or trichloroethylene was by the label attached to the container. These labels were old, and some had to be attached to the container with rubber bands. A technician named Robert Piabode picked up a bottle of trichloroethylene, which is a solvent, and placed it in a mechanical mixer. But wait, that wasn't trichloroethylene. The technician accidentally picked up a bottle of uranium solution and placed it in a mixer full of sodium carbonate. Later, other employees would discover that the label had fallen off the container, and adding uranium to the mixer created a criticality event. Basically, Robert Piabode created an uncontrolled nuclear reactor. The solution inside the mixer emitted a blue light, and part of it splashed onto Piabode. He immediately ran to the emergency check area, taking off all his clothes and standing naked. But he collapsed before arriving. Robert Piabode had been bombarded with high doses of neutrons and gamma rays. He had been exposed to at least 100 sieverts of radiation, or 10 times the guaranteed lethal dose of radiation, something above 1 million chest X-rays. He lived for 49 hours after the exposure. The ambulance that transported him to the hospital was so severely contaminated that it had to be incinerated